This is Jenica Betch, and you are listening to the UChicago Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. This is UC3P, our eponymously named podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. My name is David Raban, and I'm the production manager for what we like to call the main page. Today, we continue our mini-series exploring the crisis surrounding COVID-19. We speak with Anna Carroll, an expert on responses to pandemics and other global health crises. Ms. Carroll is a fellow at the Global Health Policy Center. She released an article last fall calling for increased spending on pandemic prevention, and she released an article a few weeks ago outlining how this crisis could play out. Last week, she released an article on privacy and contact tracing, which we will link to in the show notes. Before we get into the interview, a few notes. First, we're all getting used to online recordings, so please be patient with us as we figure out how to improve our sound quality. Second, we recorded this interview on April 15, so continue to bear with us as the situation rapidly changes. Finally, remember to check in next week as we'll have another episode on the coronavirus. Now, let's get straight into the interview. Without further ado, here's global health policy expert Anna Carroll. My name is David Raban.
And my name is Caroline Kubzansky.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Anna Carroll, who's a fellow at the Global Health Policy Center. Ms. Carroll, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Let's talk first about prevention. So last October, before anyone knew COVID-19 even existed, you wrote an article arguing for an investment in pandemic preparedness. What were you thinking at the time, and how do you look back now at that article?
So I've been very fortunate to support an effort out of CSIS, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And for the last year or so, I've been involved in a commission that CSIS runs called the Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security. And the commission is comprised of about 22 experts that span the global health and the security space. And the goal of the commission was to shine a light on the issue of global health security for U.S. policymakers. Global health security is a concept that was gaining momentum before COVID, but was still, I would argue, underappreciated. And the basic concept is that global health issues, and particularly infectious disease threats, whether they are natural, deliberate, or accidental, can pose and constitute national security threats to the United States. You know, we would often point to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, 2014 and through 2016, or the Ebola outbreak in the DRC that unfortunately may be sort of resurging a little bit right now. You know, these types of epidemics were the most recent instances of infectious disease threats that originated overseas, but potentially threatened, you know, American citizens and American interests, both overseas and domestically. However, now that COVID-19 has arrived and we face a true global pandemic of just, you know, catastrophic proportions, I think that there's a greater degree of understanding among U.S. policymakers and globally about how infectious disease threats and global health issues can not just threaten human lives and cause sort of mass casualty events, but can also have devastating economic impact. And so these were issues that a number of really, really smart and devoted and motivated people have been working on for several years. And I, you know, joined that movement over the last few years in my career. But I think that it will likely gain some more sort of followers, you know, in the wake of this pandemic.
In your article, you argued for somewhere close to $1 billion in spending for preparedness. I guess I have two opposite questions. First, if we really want to be prepared, would $1 billion have been enough? And second, is it possible that we never really could have been prepared for something like COVID-19?
So, whether the $1 billion figure is sufficient, there are, we were citing and building off of World Bank studies that were assessing what would be needed to ensure baseline preparedness. But I think, the larger argument that the Commission was trying to make and that we were trying to make in our final report, incidentally was released last fall, is that it's not a large amount of money that's required to ensure greater security from the global health perspective, both internationally and domestically. When you compare that figure with sort of the astronomical amounts that are spent on U.S. defense, for example, and defense infrastructure, I think the larger argument that we were trying to make was that it's worth putting another $1 billion, a few $100 million more dollars into this effort, because it can save so many lives and it can save us from unnecessary economic damage, the likes of which we're seeing play out before our eyes today. In terms of whether the U.S. could have been better prepared for COVID-19, I would certainly argue that it could have been. One of the major arguments that we made in the Commission report was to reestablish leadership on the National Security Council. So the Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense, which was established under previous administrations, dismantled under the Trump administration, and having a sort of central node for high-level leadership at the highest level at the White House to oversee the interagency effort that's required to respond to something as cross-cutting as an epidemic as we're seeing today. That's really invaluable. And I think that not having that leadership at that level contributed to the slow response that we've witnessed over the last several months in the U.S. So that's just one, sort of concrete example, but there are certainly more ways in which the U.S. could have been prioritizing public health infrastructure in the U.S., prioritizing the monitoring and the response to global health threats, both, in terms of financial and budgetary contributions, but also in terms of just sort of bureaucratic structures.
So we're now well past the stage of prevention. Can we talk about what the government should be doing right now? You've written about non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is the technical term for things like sheltering in place or business closures. And what do you think the government can do in the midst of the pandemic to support these non-pharmaceutical solutions?
So what we're seeing play out in the United States today is a patchwork of policies around social distancing measures. So there are still a handful of states that have not, closed down non-essential businesses, that are allowing folks to continue to go to work. Whereas, in other states and, places like New York and in Washington, D.C., where I live, and in California, there are more strict restrictions on movement and sort of lockdowns in place. And I think the lack of cohesiveness across the United States, creates loopholes for the virus to move. People move, and so the virus will move with it. But it also generates confusion across the U.S. And I think there's a lot of confusion now about, to what degree those measures are necessary, how long they will need to be in place for, whether they're actually working. And I think particularly now, I would certainly argue that they are working extremely well. And we've seen that as hotspots have sort of cooled across the U.S. And even in New York, which is the worst hotspot in the world at this point, they're at the apex and they're starting to flatten the curve, even as death rates remain, terribly high. So I think that a unified policy around social distancing is really necessary. And unfortunately, it doesn't appear as though this administration is interested in doing that. The president has repeatedly, reiterated that it will be up to the governors to decide what policies to be implemented in their state. There's something to be said for localized responses, surely. But I think when it comes to social distancing and that sort of initial response and initial intervention, a more cohesive approach across the U.S. would have been really important.
It just as you say, from the start of this crisis, each state has acted on its own. Today, the day that we're recording this is Wednesday, April 15, and we heard this week that Democratic governors are now making pacts for when to lift restrictions and to reopen their economies, less from an economic perspective, but more from a global public health or even just a national public health perspective. In the situation you described, this wouldn't be happening. The federal government would be coordinating all the actions and we would be moving in a unified way. But with the federal government acting as it is it actually the case that what these governors are doing in making a pact is the next best solution? Maybe another way of phrasing the question is, if there's not a first best solution, is there a second best?
I definitely welcome the move from the governors to try to coordinate and come up with a unified regional response. What we know, because we've seen this in other countries, particularly in Asia, in China, in Singapore, in South Korea, what we know is that as restrictions on movement are eased, there will be spikes and upticks in case counts. So it's important that the easing of restrictions be coordinated across geographic areas where there might be more movement. So I certainly think that the efforts to work in tandem in the Northeast and along the Western coast are really strategic. That way, Governor Cuomo talked about this a lot when he was in the earlier days of the response in New York. It's easy for people to leave. If they don't like, how severe a restriction is where they're currently living, where they're currently staying, they can go across the border and try to make something work there. And as long as that's the case, again, the virus will continue to move. So I think the move by the governors is really welcome. I think it's unfortunate that it's being left to them to coordinate amongst themselves and to coordinate things like the procurement of PPE and ventilators and other critical commodities. That's the sort of role that you would expect the federal government to play in a crisis like this.
One thing that this crisis has really laid bare, but it's something that we've seen a lot just generally with the current federal administration, especially with comparing it, even with the last 2 or 3 federal administrations. The question is, who should be making decisions? Should experts who have PhDs and expertise in a field be making decisions about things like public health and other matters of life and death? Or should politicians who are democratically accountable and that we've voted for and we've given our trust in be making these decisions for us? I think that's kind of a core tension in public policy, and it's something that right now there's no better time to ask that question, to see what should we be doing? How should we be making decisions as a society and as a federal government to protect things like our lives and our health and our economy?
Well, I'm going to give a bit of a biased answer here because I come from a public health background. I believe really, really strongly that scientists and public health experts need to be driving the policy right now. And I believe for the most part, they are, and they're playing a major role. However, we have seen, for example, that the CDC has been largely sidelined from the response following the very real testing debacle earlier in the year. And while that testing failure was just incredibly detrimental to the U.S. response, the U.S. CDC is still home to the best public health and infectious disease and pandemic preparedness and response experts in the world. And so you would hope that they would be more involved. I think in a situation like this, I think sort of reminds us how like short-term our domestic politics can be, and how we're in the middle of an election year. And so I think it's too easy for the realities of that political pressures that come along with an election year to take precedence over public health guidance and evidence-based interventions and evidence-based policy. So I think when we're facing a crisis that's driven by a novel infectious disease, it's just too risky to let politics lead. That's where I sort of fall on that. But I agree and I respect that it's a difficult tension and it's a difficult balance to strike. But I think in a crisis moment like this, to me, the answer is pretty straightforward, and it should be the scientists and the public health experts.
You've been listening to our conversation with Anna Carroll, a fellow at the Global Health Policy Center. We'll be back in a moment to talk best and worst case scenarios. Stay tuned.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
This is Carolyn Kubzansky.
And I'm David Raban.
And we're back with Anna Carroll.
Ms. Carroll, as I had mentioned earlier, we're talking on Wednesday, April 15. You released an article last week that outlines a best case scenario, a mixed case scenario, and a worst